how does a society really figure out who it is? I mean, why do some political movements, some, big ideas feel so incredibly powerful, so deeply true to people that they're willing to commit everything to them, while other perfectly reasonable ideas just, well, they don't catch fire?
It's a really fundamental question, isn't it? It gets beyond just the surface politics, the day-to-day stuff, and asks what actually gives a political community its vitality, its ability to act and, endure in the world.
And today, that's exactly what we're doing. We're taking a deep dive into that very question, looking through the lens of a truly significant, though, challenging work. Eric Voegelin's The New Science of Politics.
That's right. And this book, it started as lectures back in 1951, and you can see it had some serious academic backing. The Walgreen Foundation, Guggenheim, LSU, supportive colleagues mentioned right in the foreword. It's not your typical political science textbook just looking at, say, how governments function.
No, definitely not.
Voegelin goes much, much deeper. He's asking how a society actually comes into being politically. How does it act on the historical stage? And crucially, how its understanding of itself, its whole identity, is fundamentally tied to its relationship with truth, with reality itself.
It is dense stuff, I won't lie. But it's also packed with these kind of aha moments that can completely change how you look at political events, past and present. So our mission here is really to unpack the most important concepts for you.
Yeah, to pull out the key nuggets.
Exactly. Like what Voegelin actually means by representation, and it's way more than just electing someone. It's about how a society becomes real, how it can act. Then how that connects to the idea of a society representing something transcendent, something beyond itself, which of course brings us straight to the role of truth.
Truth becomes central.
And then there's his really thought-provoking, maybe even controversial analysis of modern politics through this lens of what he calls Gnosticism.
We'll definitely track his argument, follow his path, and he uses lots of historical examples like ancient empires, Rome, the English Civil War, to really ground these big ideas.
So think of us as your guides on this journey. We'll help you navigate this rich, sometimes complex material. We're going to start with the basics, how societies gain political existence, then move into that crucial link between existence and truth. We'll look at some historical struggles over whose truth wins out in a society.
That's a fascinating part, the Roman section especially.
Yeah. And then we'll tackle this concept of Gnosticism. What is it, according to Voegelin, and why does he think it's so important for understanding modernity? And finally, we'll consider what his whole analysis might mean for the world we're living in right now.
It's definitely a different way of looking at politics, maybe not what you're used to hearing, but it offers some incredibly powerful insights, I think.
Okay, let's unpack this. So Voegelin kicks things off by really challenging how we usually think about society, right? He said it's not just some external thing we can stand back and observe.
Exactly. He uses this term, a cosmion. He calls society a little world. And the absolutely essential thing, for him, is the meaning it has from within.
Meaning from within. What does that look like in practice? Is it like shared values or?
It's more like the shared experience of the people living in it. An experience that's illuminated, brought to life by the symbols they create and live by. Think about myths, rituals, the stories a society tells about itself, even its political theories. These symbols aren't just window dressing.
Yeah.
They are how people actually experience their own participation in that society as something meaningful, something connected to their core human experience. It links their individual lives to a larger whole that feels bigger, more significant than just themselves.
So it's the shared understanding, the collective story, the rituals.
Yeah.
That's the inner life of the society.
Yeah.
That's what makes it feel like more than just, a bunch of people living in the same place.
Precisely. It's that internal illumination that's fundamental. That's what makes society a cosmion, not just an objective fact you can study like a rock. It's how individuals experience belonging to something that feels essential to their very human essence.
Now, he gets into something tricky here, distinguishing between the symbols people use in political reality and the symbols that theorists develop about that reality.
Yes, and this is a major source of confusion, he argues. Let's take an example he uses later. Think about a political term like the realm of freedom in Marxist thought.
Okay, the communist ideal state.
Right. That phrase, realm of freedom, is a symbol used by people in political reality to describe their goal, their hope. But then a political theorist, someone like Voegelin analyzing Marxism, might step back and describe that same concept using very different language. They might call it an immanentist hypostasis of a Christian eschatological symbol.
Whoa, okay, hold on. Let's translate that. Immanentist hypostasis.
Huh, yeah, it's a mouthful. Basically, a eschatological symbol refers to an idea about the end times, the ultimate fulfillment, like the Christian concept of the kingdom of God beyond history. Immanentist hypostasis means taking that idea of ultimate fulfillment and treating it as if it's something that can be fully achieved within history, here on Earth, through human effort, making something transcendent, concrete, and worldly, essentially.
Got it. So the theorist's fancy language is describing the structure and origin of the idea, while the Marxist language is the idea itself being used politically as a motivator.
Exactly right. The theorist terms immanentist, hypostasis, they aren't words the political actors themselves typically use. And the political actors' term realm of freedom isn't really useful for the theorist's critical analysis of how that idea functions. Voegelin's point is crucial. These aren't just two different definitions for the same word. They are two distinct sets of symbols. But because the words or sounds might overlap, people easily get confused. They start thinking that the symbols used in political reality are the same thing as the abstract concepts used to analyze that reality.
And that confusion, well, it sounds like it could really muddy the waters when we try to understand what's actually going on in politics. He uses the Soviet Union, I remember, to show a related difference, this time between two kinds of representation.
A very concrete example. He contrasts the constitutional view of representation, which was and is common in the West, with the existential view that was articulated by the communists.
The constitutional view, that's the one focused on the rules, the procedures, voting, parliaments.
Yes. From that perspective, Western Democrats would look at the Soviet system, see the single-party monopoly, and say, well, that's not genuine representation because people don't have a real choice between different parties or candidates in an election. The mechanism is flawed.
But the Soviets had a completely different take on it.
Totally different. From their perspective, the existential view, representation wasn't primarily about the voting mechanism. It was about embodying the true interest of the people as a whole. They argued that you had to exclude parties representing special interests, like, capitalists or landowners, so that the Communist Party could represent the pure, undifferentiated interest of the working class, the people.
So for them, only their system, with the party acting as the sole mediator, was a genuine people's democracy.
That was their claim. The argument hinged entirely on the party's unique role as the interpreter and executor of the people's true will.
Okay, so the debate wasn't about election mechanics, fundamentally. It was about who or what truly speaks for the collective will, for the society itself.
Precisely. And leaving aside the debate about whose view is correct, Voegelin makes a crucial point. Regardless of the constitutional forms, the Soviet government undeniably did represent Soviet society in an existential sense.
Oh, wait, now we need to unpack that. What exactly does existential representation mean here?
It means that the society, through its representative, in this case the Soviet government and party, gains existence for action in history. It becomes a coherent unit that can act.
How do we see that?
Well, the Soviet government could issue commands that were, by and large, habitually obeyed within its borders. And critically, its actions on the international stage, making treaties, waging war, controlling resources, these actions were understood both internally and externally as the actions of the Soviet Union as a whole. It was a unified actor in the world.
So a society is existentially represented when it can actually do things collectively, when it acts as a single entity on the world stage.
Yes, that's the core idea. And this requires having rulers, or a ruling structure, that commands that habitual obedience from the population. The ruler's acts, like passing a law, aren't just seen as their personal philosophical ideas. They carry obligatory force for the entire society. They speak for the whole.
And how does a society get to that point where
Right.
it can act as a unit like that?
That formation process is what Voegelin calls articulation. It's the complex, often messy, historical process by which a group of human beings forms itself into a society that can act collectively.
It's the organizing principle.
You could think of it that way. The result of successful articulation is that the society finds rulers, or representative institutions, whose acts can effectively stand for the society as a whole. This is what enables it to exist and function on the historical stage beyond just being a collection of individuals.
So articulation is how people organize themselves politically, structuring themselves to become a single body capable of unified action.
Exactly. Imagine, raw materials, individuals, families, tribes being shaped and structured into a complex tool or maybe even a living body. It gains the ability to perform coordinated, purposeful actions that the individual parts, just on their own, simply couldn't achieve.
You mentioned earlier that it can be difficult, especially in modern democracies, to clearly separate the ruler's power from their relationship to the people they represent.
It is tricky. Our modern democratic language, or symbolism, tends to blur the lines. We often talk about the people ruling themselves, blending the idea of the realm or the state with the subjects or citizens. We can be maybe a bit uncomfortable acknowledging that representation, even democratic representation, still involves someone or some institution acting for the whole in a way that requires obedience and distinguishes ruler from ruled.
But older ways of speaking were clearer.
Voegelin points out that medieval language, for instance, could distinguish between the realm as an entity and the subjects within it more easily, without the sort of emotional resistance we might feel today.
He traces some of this historical development, this articulation process, in England, looking at things like the Magna Carta and early parliamentary summons.
Yes. He examines how, over time, representatives from specific, already articulate groups, think of the major barons, baronagium, or important cities and boroughs started coming together in the King's Council. This council, evolving into parliament, gradually came to represent the entire realm.
But initially, the power was clearly with the king.
Oh, absolutely. Early writs of summons, say from the 13th or 14th century, clearly show the weight remained with the king. The prelates, the magnates, the cities, they were described as his. Individual merchants were identified as being of the realm or of their city, while ordinary individuals were simply inhabitants. The term people wasn't used back then to designate a specific representable rank or estate within the system. It was more a synonym for the realm as a whole, like in phrases about the common welfare of the realm.
So it was a layered process, building up, representatives of specific groups coming together, all in relation to the king, eventually forming a body that represented the whole kingdom.
That's the picture he paints. And over a long period, this representative hierarchy gradually consolidated, melted together, you might say. It eventually became theoretically tangible centuries later in the concept of a single supreme representative entity, the king in parliament.
And he makes a big point that this particular kind of articulation, the one that eventually allows for individuals to be seen as representable units, that's specific to the West.
He argues very strongly that it is. This peculiar type of political articulation, this specific historical path, isn't some universal human default. It's tied to very particular historical conditions and experiences found in Greco-Roman civilization and the subsequent Western societies. Conditions, he notes, that were largely absent in other major civilizational areas, like the Orient.
So, to circle back, articulation is the absolutely necessary condition for society to achieve this existential representation.
Yes, that's the core argument. Articulation is the process through which a society forms itself sufficiently to produce an existential representative, whether that's a king, a parliament, a party, whatever, and thus comes into existence as an actor in history.
And he notes that people really only try to theorize this process, to understand it deeply at critical moments.
Right. When a society is first forming, or when it's disintegrating, or when it's going through some kind of major epical shift, that's when the question of how do we hold together or how did we form becomes urgent.
Like the consolidation of nations in the 15th century.
Exactly. A key epical phase in the West was that consolidation of the national realms like England and France around the mid-15th century, coming out of huge disruptions like the 100 Years' War.
And he brings in Sir John Fortescue as a theorist who tried to explain this consolidation.
Yes, Fortescue, writing in the late 15th century, was trying to make sense of this newly solidified English realm. He used these powerful organic analogies. The body politic needs a head. The king, Rex erectus est, the king is erected. And he developed these really striking concepts. Eruption, which is the idea of the people flowing together, bursting forth to form the political body.
Like a volcanic eruption creating land.
Kind of, yeah. And then proruption, the bursting forth of the head, the king, from that body.
Those images really capture the dynamic, the emergence of a political entity.
They do. And Voegelin sees this as a significant theoretical achievement because it highlights that foundational element, the people forming the body, the component in representation that often gets forgotten or obscured later on, especially when purely legal ways of thinking about the state come to dominate.
Fortescue also used a Christian symbol, the corpus mysticum, the mystical body, but applied it to the realm.
Yes, and this is a really important symbolic shift. He transferred the symbol of the corpus mysticum, which traditionally referred to the church, the body of Christ, onto the political realm, the kingdom.
What did that signify?
Voegelin sees it as symptomatic of a major historical change. the decline of the older universal Christian society, articulated as church and empire, and the rise of these distinct national realms as the primary focus of political life and loyalty. It signaled that these realms were acquiring a kind of peculiar ultimacy of meaning. They were becoming the successor entities, in a way, succeeding both empire and church as the ultimate ordering force in people's lives.
And Fortescue had another key term, intentio populi.
Intentio populi, the intention of the people. Fortescue used this to signify the realm's inner substance, its underlying will, its collective purpose. This intention, this substance, was what provided the society's binding force, its coherence.
So the king's legitimacy wasn't just from God.
It's not solely. Fortescue explicitly connected the king's power and legitimacy to this intentio populi. It wasn't just divine grace or heredity or even election. The king is established by the people's consent, a consent rooted in this underlying collective intention or will of the people forming the realm.
He even used a myth to illustrate the story of Brute and the Britons.
Yes, exactly. He recounted the, mythical story of Brute leading the migrating Britons, how they formed themselves into a political body, chose Brute as their head, and ordained laws that they all agreed to. It's a foundational myth used to illustrate this whole process. Eruption, forming the body, corruption, choosing the head, all based on the community's intention and consent.
Voegelin also briefly mentions even earlier, perhaps more primal forms of articulation like migrating groups.
Right. He touches on examples like the Lombards under their leader Alboin, as described by Paulus Diaconus. This shows a more concrete, initial kind of articulation. It's driven by the raw material, the tribal groupings, the pressure of circumstances like needing to move or conquer territory, and the influence of distinguished leaders, people who stand out due to bloodline or personal charisma. It shows the basic forces that can kickstart the process of forming a society capable of unified action.
So articulation is crucial for forming a society. But the concept is also relevant when a society might be falling apart.
Yes, absolutely. And for that side of the coin, Voegelin brings in the work of Maurice Horiot, a French legal theorist who was writing during the shaky period of the French Third Republic, observing its potential for disintegration.
What was Horiot's main point or warning?
Horiot argued, and Voegelin clearly agrees, that for a government or an institution to be truly stable and effective, it must be representative not just in the constitutional sense.
Meaning having the right elections, the right procedures.
Right. Not just that. It must also be representative in the existential sense. It needs to truly embody and realize what Horiot called the idea of the institution, the deeper purpose, the animating spirit, the inner substance of that particular society or institution.
And if it's only constitutionally representative, it's just going through the motions, legally correct, but disconnected from that deeper substance.
Then Horiot's warning is quite stark. If a government lacks that existential connection, if it loses touch with the society's inner reality and purpose, even if it follows all the constitutional rules, then eventually an existential ruler will emerge to fill that vacuum, someone who does connect with, or claims to connect with, that deeper reality. And this new ruler, while perhaps restoring a sense of existential unity, might not be constitutional at all. They might sweep the old forms away.
So just having the right democratic structures isn't a guarantee against collapse if the society itself loses its internal cohesion or a sense of shared purpose.
Not according to Horiot, and Voegelin uses his work to reinforce that point about the primacy of existential reality.
Okay, that feels like a good place for a quick recap of this first section on representation and existence.
Sounds good. So the key takeaways here are, first, a political society isn't just an external object, it's a cosmion, a little world, whose existence depends on the meaning generated within it through shared symbols, myths, rituals, theories.
Right, the internal illumination.
Exactly. Second, we need to be careful to distinguish symbols used in political reality, like realm of freedom, from the concepts theorists use to analyze that reality, like immanentist hypostasis. Confusing them leads to misunderstandings.
Okay.
Third, representation has two key meanings. There's the elemental or constitutional type, elections, parliaments. But more fundamentally, there's existential representation, how a society gains reality for action in history, becoming a unified actor.
And that happens through
articulation. That's the fourth point. Articulation is the process by which people form themselves into a society capable of action, producing rulers or institutions whose acts represent the whole. And fifth, this specific Western type of articulation, involving individuals as representable units, is historically peculiar, not universal.
Got it. and theories about it pop up at critical times.
Right, which brings us to Fortescue, theorizing the consolidation of national realms in the 15th century. Remember his concepts: eruption, people forming the body; corruption, the head emerging; the transfer of the corpus mysticum symbol to the realm; and the idea of the intentio populi, the people's intention, as the binding substance.
And finally, Horia's warning.
Yes, Harrier reminding us that constitutional representation isn't enough. A government needs existential representation to embody the idea of the institution, to prevent disintegration and the potential rise of a non-constitutional existential ruler. Focusing only on the constitutional forms is, Voegelin says, a kind of dangerous provincialism.
That gives us a really solid foundation. Society exists through articulation and representation. Now let's build on that and turn to how this existing society connects to something beyond itself, to truth. Okay, so we've established how a society comes into existence and acts as a unit that's existential representation. But can it represent something more than just itself? Something, I don't know, transcendent?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
This is the next crucial layer: representation in the transcendental sense. And Voegelin argues that this relationship where a society sees itself as representing something beyond its own immediate existence is found practically everywhere in history. It's almost universal.
Really? Where do we see that?
Well, think about the earliest empires, especially in the Near and Far East. They didn't just see themselves as, powerful political units. They understood themselves as earthly representatives of the cosmic order.
Like a mirror of the heavens on earth.
Precisely that kind of idea. The empire itself was conceived as a kind of miniature cosmos, an analog to the universe. Its territory might be organized to reflect the four quarters of the world, its ceremonial life timed to enact cosmic rhythms, its great festivals and sacrifices seen as participating in a kind of ongoing cosmic liturgy.
Yeah, the ruler.
The ruler, as the primary representative of the society in the existential sense, also became the representative of the transcendent power, the divine force that created and maintained this cosmic order. So the cosmian, the society as a little world, now becomes a representative of the entire cosmos.
That's a huge claim for any society to make. He gives the example of Darius the Thirst, the Persian king.
Yes, the Achaemenid Empire provides a fantastic illustration. Look at the Behistun inscription, where Darius proclaims his legitimacy. His victories, his rule, he claims, are possible because he is the righteous instrument of the great god Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Wisdom. Darius emphasizes that he is truthful, not wicked, nor a liar.
And his enemies.
His enemies represent the opposite, the lie, droga. Their revolts, their opposition, were caused because lies made them revolt.
So politics becomes a cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood. Establishing the empire was seen as establishing like a zone of truth and order on Earth by battling against these cosmic forces of deceit.
That's exactly the framework. Expanding the empire meant expanding the realm of Ahura Mazda's truth and peace. And this belief had direct ethical consequences for the ruler. As the representative of truth, the king himself had to be scrupulously truthful in his conduct and his words.
Didn't Darius even say he held back on recording some of his deeds?
He did, lest people disbelieve them and think he was lying. It's quite remarkable a representative of the truth couldn't risk being perceived as telling fibs, even if the fibs were true, but unbelievable achievements.
Wow. So what does that ancient example tell us about this connection, maybe a timeless one, between political power and the claim to represent some kind of higher truth?
It suggests this dynamic isn't just a quirk of ancient Persia. It's a fundamental structure in how political order often grounds itself. And Voegelin uses another quite different example to reinforce this: the Mongol Empire.
The Mongols. How did they frame their conquests in terms of truth or divine order?
Incredibly boldly. Just look at the letter Kuyu Khan sent to Pope Innocent V in the 13th century. The claim is absolute, breathtaking really. By the virtue of God, from the rising of the sun to its setting, all realms have been granted to us.
All realms, granted by God.
Yes. Their massive expansion wasn't just seen by them as military conquest. It was understood as the rightful legal execution of the order of God. Yasa.
So if you resisted the Mongols, you weren't just fighting an invading army, you were rebelling against a direct divine command.
That was precisely their perspective. They would formally notify other societies of this divine order through ambassadors. If a society refused to submit, they weren't considered legitimate enemies in a war. They were rebels against God's order, subject to punitive expeditions to enforce that order.
And Genghis Khan's famous statement fits this.
Perfectly. God is high above all. And on earth, Genghis Khan is the only Lord. It clearly positions Mongol rule as directly representing the ultimate divine authority on earth.
And Voegelin's key point here is that this structure of political power claiming to embody a transcendent order isn't just confined to ancient or nomadic empires.
Not at all. He stresses that this self-understanding, this claim to represent cosmic or divine order, originates in these cosmological empires, but is a structure that can and does reappear throughout history, including, potentially, in our own time.
Okay, let's pause for a quick micro recap on this part of representation and truth. So societies don't just exist, existential representation. They often claim to represent something beyond themselves, a higher truth or order, transcendental representation. We see this clearly in early empires viewing themselves as representatives of cosmic order. Good examples are the Achaemenid Persians, with their focus on truth versus the lie, embodied by the righteous king, and the Mongols, who claimed their empire executed the absolute order of God. And crucially, this structure, connecting political power to claims of transcendent truth, isn't limited to the ancient past. Okay, so you have these massive empires claiming to embody cosmic truth, but eventually this kind of monolithic claim gets challenged, right?
Yes, absolutely. New kinds of human experiences emerge, new ways of understanding reality arise that begin to question the idea that any single earthly empire directly and perfectly embodies the ultimate cosmic or divine order. Voegelin mentions thinkers like Karl Jaspers and his concept of the Axis time, that period around the middle of the first millennium BC when figures like Buddha, Confucius, the Hebrew prophets, and the Greek philosophers emerged, bringing new spiritual and ethical insights.
And Plato is absolutely central to this shift in the Greek context.
Hugely important. Plato fundamentally redirects the whole search for true order. Instead of starting with the external cosmos, looking outwards, Plato begins inwards with the order of the human soul. The true, well-ordered soul becomes the standard, the measure, for understanding and, importantly, for critiquing existing societies.
So the idea is that society is like a larger version of the individual human soul.
Yes, that's what Voegelin calls Plato's anthropological principle, the idea that society is man written large. The order or disorder of a political community is seen as analogous to the order or disorder within the individual soul.
And that gives you a powerful tool for criticism.
Immensely powerful, because now you can evaluate existing societies, Athens, Sparta, any polis, by comparing them to the standard of a well-ordered, healthy, virtuous soul. It shifts the basis of political judgment from cosmic alignment to the internal, ethical, and spiritual condition of human beings.
But Plato realized that just looking at the soul wasn't quite enough. It couldn't just be subjective.
Exactly. The soul itself needed a reference point. Plato understood that the anthropological principle required a grounding beyond just human opinion or feeling. So, against the sophist view, particularly Protagoras' famous statement, man is the measure, Plato asserted, God is the measure, theos metron. The ultimate standard for the soul's proper order, and therefore the standard for judging society, is divine, transcendent.
And Voegelin traces this back to earlier Greek thinkers who were already searching for some kind of deeper standard.
Yes, he points to figures like Solon, the Athenian lawgiver, searching for the unseen measure of right judgment that holds society together. Or Heraclitus talking about an invisible harmony, which is harder to grasp than the visible one, something you can only find through a deep internal search, requiring an anticipating urge within the soul itself. They were sensing this need for a transcendent standard beyond mere human convention.
And then Aristotle builds on this foundation with his understanding of philosophical theory.
Right. Aristotle really clarifies what philosophical theory is. It's not just spinning out arbitrary opinions. For Aristotle, genuine theory explicates experiences. It makes clear the structure and meaning latent within certain kinds of human experience. And its validity, its claim to truth, comes from its ability to refer back to that specific class of experiences for what he calls empirical control.
What specific class of experience is he talking about?
Primarily, the experiences of the spadios. That's Aristotle's term for the mature, serious, virtuous man.
The ideal person.
You could say that. The person who has actualized their human potential to a high degree, possessing both the intellectual virtues, dianoetic virtues like wisdom and understanding, and the ethical virtues like courage and justice. This is the person capable of taking the theoretical attitude, bios theoretikos, of contemplating truth for its own sake. In a way, Aristotle's ethics is a kind of type study of the spadios.
So good theory is grounded in the lived experience of the wise and virtuous person.
That's the idea. And Aristotle also points out the conditions needed for this kind of theory to even arise. You need the right inclination, a certain economic basis, leisure time, not being totally consumed by necessity, and a supportive social environment.
And not everyone can just understand it.
No, crucially, theory is only truly intelligible to those who share or can imaginatively reenact the parallel experiences that the theory explicates. If you don't have the relevant experiential grounding, the theory just sounds like, well, empty talk, as Aristotle puts it, or maybe just subjective opinion. Real theoretical debate, for Aristotle, requires spiritual people who share that common ground of developed virtue and experience.
And he was realistic about this.
Very. He knew such people were rare, and that a society actually ordered according to the standards of the Spoutos was practically impossible in the Athens of his day. It remained a kind of theoretical benchmark.
Okay, so why did these new philosophical insights, grounded in the soul and the experience of the Spoutios, gain such authority? Why did they successfully challenge the older truths based in myth or cosmic order?
This is where Voegelin introduces a really profound idea. It's not just about psychology or ethics in the modern sense. He argues that what happened was the discovery of the psyche itself. The soul was discovered, or perhaps better, differentiated, as a new kind of center within human beings. A center capable of experiencing openness towards transcendence, towards the divine ground of being.
The soul was opened. What does that mean?
It means it became differentiated out of a more compact, less self-aware state of human existence. Before this discovery, before this opening, man had no soul in this specific differentiated sense. He experienced reality, yes, but not through this newly recognized inner faculty oriented towards transcendent reality. This opening of the soul is a massive event, a leap in human spiritual consciousness, Voegelin argues.
And this opening isn't just a passive thing.
No, it's described as both action and passion. It's something that is actively sought or explored, action, perhaps through philosophical inquiry or spiritual discipline, but it's also something received, an experience of being drawn towards transcendence, passion. Voegelin attributes this breakthrough primarily to figures he calls mystic philosophers, thinkers, who explored this inner realm and articulated the experience of the soul's openness.
And this discovery, this opening, connects directly back to Plato's God is the measure.
Exactly. The anthropological principle, understanding society through the lens of the soul, only really works, only finds its grounding when combined with the theological principle, the understanding that the soul itself finds its true measure, its true north in God, in the transcendent divine reality. It's the discovery of the soul's openness to God that gives philosophy its critical authority against older, more compact forms of truth.
Plato even had a term for discussing different ways people symbolize the divine.
Yes, typoi peritheologias, literally types concerning theology or patterns of theologizing. He was acutely aware, especially in the Republic when discussing the education of the guardians, that the stories and symbols used to represent the divine are incredibly important. Exposing young minds to the wrong typoi, to false or misleading images of God, could actually warp the soul's core innate knowledge of the divine.
Leading to what he called the arch lie.
Precisely, the aleithos pseudos, the true lie, or the lie in the soul, which isn't just believing something false, but is a fundamental state of ignorance, agnoia, within the soul itself, a distortion at the very core of one's being regarding the highest reality. So the validity of standards like Plato's depends entirely on this understanding of the soul as oriented towards and measured by the true God.
Okay, another quick recap here on representation and truth. Early societies often saw themselves representing cosmic order, transcendental representation. This was challenged by the opening of the soul, particularly in Greek philosophy, Plato, Aristotle. The new standard became the order of the soul, anthropological principle, but this needed grounding in the divine. God is the measure, the theological principle. Philosophical theory explicates the experiences underlying this, especially the experiences of the virtuous person, the spodeos. The authority of this new truth comes from the discovered capacity of the differentiated soul to experience transcendence. False theology, however, can lead to the arch lie, ignorance in the soul. Voegelin doesn't just look at philosophy. He also sees this emergence of truth in Greek tragedy, right? Using Aeschylus' play The Suppliants as an example.
Yes, it's a brilliant example of how dramatic representation of political action can actually reveal or articulate transcendent order. The play sets up a stark conflict. You have the suppliant damsels fleeing forced marriage, appealing for refuge in Argos. Their pursuers have a kind of legal claim based on custom, nomos. But the damsels appeal to a higher law, the divine justice, diked, protected by Zeus, the god of suppliants.
And the king of Argos, Pelasgus, is caught right in the middle of this clash between human law and divine law.
He's in an impossible position. If he protects the suppliants, he risks a devastating war with the powerful Egyptians. If he abandons them to their pursuers, he violates the sacred law of Zeus and risks divine punishment on his city. He recognizes the depth of the dilemma, saying he needs deep and saving counsel like a diver exploring the depths. Voegelin connects this imagery to Heraclitus' idea, deep knowing, and the need to plumb the depths of the soul to find true judgment. The king's internal struggle is precisely this search for the right course of action, guided by that deeper divine measure.
And importantly, Pelasgus isn't a tyrant. He can't just decide on his own.
That's crucial. He explicitly says he's bound by the decision of the people, the demos. He might reach a decision in the depth of his own soul, grappling with the competing claims of nomos and dike, but the people must consent, because they are the ones who will ultimately bear the consequences, especially the suffering of war.
So how does the decision get made?
Through pytho-persuasion. The king has to make a speech to the assembly. This speech isn't just political rhetoric, it's an act of soulcraft. He has to shape the souls of his listeners, persuade them to align themselves with the dike of Zeus, overcoming their natural fear and self-interest. When the people vote unanimously to protect the suppliants, their collective decree becomes the embodiment, the representation of the truth of God in that specific political situation. As the chorus says, it is Zeus who brings the end to pass.
And the suffering that will likely follow. The war.
The chorus reflects on this coming suffering. Voegelin interprets this not just as lament, but as representative suffering. The city, the polis, by accepting this suffering, demonstrates its willingness to endure hardship to preserve its true order, the order aligned with divine law. It's a kind of sacrifice to maintain their relationship with transcendent truth.
So, tragedy reveals this divine order in moments of crisis, and philosophy then comes along and explains it more systematically.
That's the connection Voegelin draws. Philosophy takes the insights, the order revealed in the crucible of tragic representation and political action, and explicates its structure and principles. Theory becomes, in this sense, the science of order, grounded in these profound human experiences of wrestling with transcendent truth in the midst of historical existence.
Okay, let's try to summarize this whole rich section 2 on representation and truth.
All right. Key points for representation and truth. First, there's transcendental representation. Society sees itself representing something beyond its own existence, like cosmic order, seen in Echemenids, Mongols with their truthfully and order of God concepts, or later, a more differentiated transcendent truth. First, there's transcendental representation. Second, the challenge to cosmic representation comes via the opening of the soul in figures like the mystic philosophers in Plato. This leads to the anthropological principle, society is man writ large, grounded in the theological principle, God is the measure. Third, theory as science of order, Aristotle. Theory isn't just opinion, it explicates the experiences of the well-ordered soul, the spoudios, oriented towards transcendence. Its validity rests on this experiential basis. Third, theory as science of order, Aristotle. Fourth, the authority of theoretical truth comes from this newly differentiated psyche experiencing transcendence. False theology can lead to the arch-lie, agnoia, in the soul. Fifth, tragic representation, Aeschylus, shows how divine order, dike, can be revealed through political crisis, decision guided by the soul's depth, persuasion, patho, and even representative suffering. Philosophy then explicates this revealed order.
That provides a very deep understanding of how societies relate to truth. Now let's see how this played out in the intense historical drama of the Roman Empire. So we've got these different ways a society can relate to truth. Representing cosmic order, representing the truth found through the philosophically open soul, and then the truth claimed through Christian revelation. How did these different claims clash and interact within the Roman Empire?
The Roman Empire really becomes the crucial historical arena where these competing types of truth collide head-on. Voegelin emphasizes again that understanding this period requires recognizing the different ranges of experience involved, particularly the classical philosophical experience and the distinct Christian experience.
And he brings back that distinction between anthropological and soteriological truth. Remind us of that.
Right. Anthropological truth refers to the understanding of order accessible through the human soul's own structure, its inherent orientation towards the divine ground, as explored by philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. Soteriological truth, on the other hand, stems specifically from the experience of divine salvation, grace, and revelation, particularly as found in Christianity.
What was fundamentally new or different about the Christian experience in this context?
While classical philosophy, at its best, oriented the open soul towards the unseen measure, towards the transcendent, the Christian experience introduced several crucial new elements. One was the profound sense of mutuality between God and the individual soul, often described using the language of amicitia or friendship. It wasn't just orientation towards God, but potential personal relationship with God.
And grace.
Yes, the experience of divine grace actively intervening and transforming human nature from within. And perhaps most pivotally, the claim of the revelation of the divine measure itself, incarnate in the person of Christ, the Logos made flesh.
So, the Christian claim wasn't necessarily that philosophy was wrong in its search for truth, but that revelation provided a clearer, more direct, and fuller understanding.
In a way, yes. Voegelin suggests that the Christian revelation, for those who experienced it, confirmed the critical authority the soul had already gained through philosophical differentiation. It didn't negate the soul's orientation to truth, but fulfilled it and grounded it in a historical event. The very fact of revelation, he says, becomes its content.
Okay, let's do a quick micro recap for Section 3 so far, focusing on the Roman context. The Roman Empire becomes this major battleground for competing truth claims. We need to distinguish philosophical truth derived from the open soul, anthropological, from Christian truth derived from revelation and grace, soteriological. The Christian experience introduced key elements like mutuality with God, amicitia, grace, and the incarnation of the divine measure in Christ, which confirmed and specified the soul's orientation to truth. Voegelin then brings in the debate between the Roman scholar Varro and St. Augustine, particularly concerning different types of theology.
Right. Varro, writing much earlier, had tried to make sense of the complex Roman religious landscape by classifying theology into three types. Mythical, the stories poets told about the gods. Political or civil, the official state cults and rituals deemed necessary for social order. And physical or natural, the philosophical understanding of the divine nature of the cosmos. St. Augustine, centuries later in The City of God, Civitas Dei, picks up Varro's classification, but uses it primarily as a framework to critique Roman paganism and demonstrate the superiority of Christian truth.
And Civitas Dei itself was written in response to a major crisis for Rome, wasn't it?
Absolutely. It was very much a livre de circonstance, a book written for a specific, urgent historical situation. After the Visigoths under Alaric sacked the city of Rome in 410 AD, profoundly traumatic event for the Roman world, many pagans started blaming the disaster on the empire's abandonment of its traditional gods in favor of Christianity. They argued the gods were angry. Augustine wrote his massive work, The City of God, directly to counter this pagan argument and offer a Christian interpretation of history and Rome's fate. Attacking Varro's older defense of the Roman system was a key part of his strategy.
This conflict wasn't just theoretical. It played out in very concrete political struggles, like the famous affair of the altar of Victoria.
Yes, that was a major flashpoint, a real symbolic battleground. Remember, the traditional Roman cult was the official state religion for centuries, but things changed rapidly in the late 4th century. Emperor Theodosius made Orthodox Nicene Christianity the mandatory religion of the empire in 380 AD. Then, his co-emperor in the West, Gratianus, took further steps in 382. He renounced the traditional imperial title of Pontifex Maximus, chief priest, cut off state funding for pagan sacrifices and priesthoods, and, most controversially, ordered the removal of the altar of victory from the Senate house in Rome.
Why was that altar so important?
Victoria was the goddess of victory. Her altar in the Senate was where senators had traditionally sworn oaths and offered incense. It was a powerful symbol of Rome's history, its military success, and the divine favor believed to underpin it. Removing it was a direct assault on the symbolic heart of the old Roman political and religious order. It was an act of, well, unrepresenting the pagan gods within the state's core institution.
And this provoked a strong reaction.
It did. In 384, Quintus Aurelius Symmachus, a prominent pagan senator and prefect of Rome, wrote a formal petition, a relatio, to the young Emperor Valentinian II, eloquently pleading for the restoration of the altar in the traditional ways. He argued for tolerance and reverence for the ancient customs that had made Rome great.
But he was opposed.
Vehemently. By St. Ambrose, the powerful bishop of Milan, who wrote letters directly advising the emperor not to give in. Ambrose argued forcefully that a Christian emperor could not support pagan rites, framing it as a matter of loyalty to the true God versus idolatry. Ambrose won the argument. The altar was not restored.
St. Augustine also contributed to shaping the idea of what a Christian ruler should be, with his concept of the imperator Felix.
Yes, the happy emperor, or perhaps fortunate emperor. In The City of God, Augustine specifically addresses Christian emperors. He argues that their true happiness or fortune, felicitas, doesn't depend on long reigns, military victories, or the outward prosperity of the empire, things a pagan might value. Instead, it's measured by their justice, their humility, their piety, their ruling as Christians, using their power to serve God's majesty. This section became incredibly influential, effectively launching the whole medieval genre of the Mirror of the Prince advice books on how a Christian ruler should behave.
But Voegelin identifies a kind of blind spot here. While figures like Ambrose and Augustine were fighting passionately for Christianity to become the truth represented by the empire, they didn't seem to fully grasp the consequences of dismantling the old order.
That's his argument. He suggests they were so focused on establishing Christian truth that they were largely unaware they were, in effect, creating and imposing a new theologia civilis, a new state theology, using the coercive power of the state. They were treating pagans much as Christians had been treated earlier. Voegelin contrasts this with the pagan critic Celsus, writing back in the 3rd century during the persecutions. Celsus, Voegelin notes, seemed to understand the stakes better. He saw that the Christian de-divinization, their rejection of the traditional gods embedded in the state and in various ethnic cultures, wasn't just a religious dispute. It spelled the end of an entire civilizational epoch based on those polytheistic foundations.
So Augustine, from his Christian perspective, couldn't really comprehend why someone like Varro would take the old gods and rituals seriously as a form of truth. But Varro, and someone like Cicero, understood something about Roman identity that Augustine perhaps missed.
Exactly. For Roman traditionalists like Varro or Cicero, the Roman cults, the rituals, the sacred laws, these weren't just empty superstitions, though intellectuals might interpret them philosophically. They symbolized the very truth of Roman society. They were intertwined with what made Rome Rome. Cicero, for instance, found Greek philosophy intellectually stimulating, but he felt it lacked existential weight, existential meaning for a Roman citizen. Rome's identity, its history, its destiny was its relationship with its gods, embodied in its civil theology.
And Cicero even adapted Greek philosophical ideas to fit this distinctly Roman framework.
Yes, famously. He took the Stoic cosmopolitan idea that every person has 2 countries, their local city, polis, and the universal city of reason and humanity, cosmopolis. Cicero reworks this into the idea that a Roman has 2 fatherlands, his native town or region, and Rome itself. For Cicero, the Imperium Romanum, the Roman Empire, was the cosmopolis made concrete. The universal order wasn't just an abstract philosophical idea, it was embodied in the reality of Rome and its divinely sanctioned rule expressed through its civil theology.
And this Roman identity, grounded in its own specific civil theology, was incredibly resilient for centuries.
Immensely so. Voegelin suggests this traditional Roman substance, its sense of self, maintained its strength until roughly the 3rd century AD. Then, as the empire faced profound crises and transformations, as the old city-state identity fully merged into the vast multicultural empire, the old Roman civil theology started to lose its binding power. That's when the struggle among the alternative truths circulating in the empire, various philosophical schools, Oriental mystery cults, and crucially, Christianity became absolutely critical. The ultimate existential representative, the emperor, was increasingly forced to choose which truth the empire as a whole would represent, because the old Roman mythos was no longer sufficient to hold the complex reality together.
And this struggle for truth coincided with a fundamental shift in the form of Roman representation itself, with the rise of the Principate, the imperial system.
Yes, the two are deeply intertwined. The Principate, the system established by Augustus, didn't just appear out of nowhere. It evolved organically out of the existing Roman social structure, particularly the deeply ingrained system of patronage.
Patronage, like powerful people having followers they looked after.
Exactly, but on a massive scale and highly formalized, Roman society was structured by these complex networks of personal relationships based on reciprocal obligation fides between influential men, patrons, patroni, and their dependents or followers, clients, clientes. This involved favors, protection, legal help, political support. The most powerful senators, the wealthy elite, were the greatest patrons, the principes civitatis, leading citizens.
So Roman politics wasn't just about institutions, but heavily driven by these personal loyalties and rivalries.
Absolutely. The late Republic was essentially characterized by intense, often violent power struggles among great aristocratic party leaders whose power base rested on these vast networks of clients and accumulated wealth. Their alliances, amicitiae, and feuds, inimicitiae, shaped Roman politics. These conflicts often escalated beyond political maneuvering into something closer to civil war, though sometimes framed, as Octavian framed his conflict with Antony and Cleopatra, as a bellum justum, a formal war against a public enemy rather than just an internal field.
And the constant military expansion of Rome played a big role in changing this system.
A huge role. Creating large, professional, long-service armies to conquer and hold overseas territories had a transformative effect. Soldiers, especially veterans needing land upon retirement, became heavily dependent on their commanders, the great generals or principes. Whole legions effectively became the personal clientele of their general.
Which gave these generals enormous power, independent of the Senate.
Precisely. This concentration of military power and personal loyalty in the hands of a few individuals, combined with the immense wealth flowing in from the provinces, allowed these powerful party leaders to challenge and eventually overwhelm the traditional authority of the Senate and the Republic's institutions. Loyalty oaths, which were originally personal between a patron and his clients, became increasingly formalized and extended, especially after the time of Marius around 100 BC, with generals demanding oaths directly from their soldiers. Hereditary ties were also crucial. Caesar's veterans, for instance, felt a strong loyalty to his heir, Octavian.
Okay, let's pause again for a micro recap of this part of Section 3. We're seeing the Roman Empire as this crucible where anthropological, philosophical, and soteriological Christian truth claims battled for dominance. Christianity eventually triumphed, establishing itself as a new civil theology, but critics like Celsus had already foreseen the profound civilizational disruption this would cause to the old polytheistic order. Meanwhile, the very form of Roman representation was shifting. The Principate, the imperial system, evolved out of the traditional Roman social structure of patron-client relationships, fueled by military expansion and the concentration of power in the hands of great leaders whose armies became vast personal clienteles.
So, the system Augustus created, the Principate, cleverly combined the old, familiar constitutional forms of the Republic, Senate, magistrates, etc., with this new reality of existential representation. The entire empire, the diverse peoples within it, were now existentially represented by the single figure of the princeps, the emperor.
And how was this new representation formally established?
The key mechanism, Voegelin highlights, was the ingenious extension of the traditional clientele oath to the population at large. Before his final showdown with Antony and Cleopatra in 32 BC, Octavian, later Augustus, had the civilian population of Italy and the western provinces swear a personal oath of allegiance to him as their leader, docox. This conjuration of the West, initially an emergency measure for a civil war, became a permanent institution under the empire. The oath was renewed regularly, probably annually after Caligula.
So the personal loyalty structure of the patronate was basically scaled up to encompass the entire empire, with the emperor as the universal patron.
That's a good way to put it. The patronal structure provided the social and symbolic grammar for the new imperial form of representation.
But Voegelin suggests this system, based on that personal, almost sacred bond of the patronate, was inherently fragile.
It was. Its stability depended crucially on people continuing to experience that relationship with the emperor, that loyalty, as a kind of sacramental bond, something with deep binding significance in the traditional Roman sense. Augustus himself seemed aware of this fragility. His extensive moral and religious reforms, reviving ancient priesthoods, building temples, promoting traditional virtues, can be seen in part as attempts to reinforce these sentiments, to shore up the waning psychological and spiritual foundations of the patronal relationship upon which his power rested.
And alongside these reforms, there were also deliberate attempts to create a new civil theology for the empire, like the imperial cult.
Yes, the cult of the emperor. Often the deceased and divinized emperor, but sometimes the living one, and the cult of the goddess Roma, the personification of Rome itself. Voegelin stresses that we shouldn't underestimate the seriousness of these efforts. They weren't necessarily just cynical political manipulation. They represented genuine attempts to find a new religious focus, a new civil theology that could provide unity and legitimacy for the vast, diverse empire, now that the old Roman city-state cults were insufficient.
And spiritually, these weren't always that far from some forms of Christianity.
Interestingly, no. He points out that spiritually, the tendency in late Roman paganism towards Simodiism, the belief in a single highest divine power, perhaps identified with Jupiter or Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, or even the abstract concept of divine providence overseeing the empire, was actually converging in some ways with monotheistic trends, including Christianity. He even mentions a prayer recorded by the Christian writer Lactantius, supposedly used by Emperor Licinius before a battle in 313. The prayer addresses a highest god in terms that could be acceptable to either a pagan Simodius or a Christian. Lactantius himself interpreted it as evidence of Licinius's near conversion.
So if the old paganism was weakening and even converging somewhat, how did Christianity finally achieve not just tolerance, but eventually dominance? Voegelin looks closely at the Edict of Toleration issued around 311-313.
Right. The edicts issued first by Galerius and then confirmed by Constantine and Licinius, which effectively ended the last great persecution and granted Christians freedom of worship. Voegelin finds the interpretation offered by the Dutch historian Hendrik Berkhoff compelling. Berkhoff suggested it wasn't primarily about the emperor suddenly having a personal conversion experience, though Constantine's later conversion is another story.
What was it about then?
It was more pragmatic, almost fearful. Berkhoff argued that the emperors, particularly Galerius, who had been a fierce persecutor, were finally convinced by Christianity's sheer resilience, its ability to survive and even thrive under intense pressure, that the Christian God must be incredibly powerful. And if this God was so powerful, it was dangerous not to treat him with respect.
So it wasn't necessarily belief, but caution. Like, better appease this powerful deity.
Exactly. It taps into that very old, very Roman principle of do it as I give that you may give. Or perhaps, in this case, I stop persecuting so that you, powerful Christian God, might not take revenge on me or the empire.
Like the Edict of Galerius explicitly mentioned.
Yes, the wording is fascinating. Galerius notes that under persecution, the Christians were not only failing to worship the traditional gods, but were also being prevented from properly worshiping their own God. The underlying logic seems to be, this situation is dangerous. These Christians aren't praying properly to their potentially wrathful deity. Better let them worship freely, so their God might look favorably upon the emperors and the state. It's a remarkably Roman, almost superstitious calculation of divine power politics.
Let's go back briefly to Celsus, the 2nd, 3rd century pagan critic you mentioned. He saw Christianity as fundamentally disruptive.
Yes, Voegelin brings him up again because Celsus had a remarkably clear-eyed view of the political implications. Celsus accused Christians of promoting stasis factionalism, sedition, discord within the empire. He saw them as effectively political rebels because their refusal to participate in the state cults and their rejection of the local traditional gods undermined the very fabric of the Roman order, which was built on this patchwork of diverse but integrated cults and cultures under Roman authority.
Celsus understood the existential threat to the old order.
He absolutely grasped the existential problem that Christian monotheism posed to traditional polytheism and the civilizational structure built upon it. He saw that if Christianity won, it meant the end of an entire epoch. Origen, the Christian scholar who wrote a detailed reply to Celsus, had to argue that a different kind of unity, a spiritual unity under Christ, was possible and indeed destined to prevail.
And before the Christians fully developed their political theology, Jewish thinkers like Philo of Alexandria had already been trying to bridge the gap between their tradition and the Greco-Roman world.
Briefly, yes. Voegelin notes that figures like Philo Judaeus, living in Alexandria, made significant efforts to present Judaism in terms attractive to the Hellenistic world. They adapted concepts, portraying the God of Israel as the true King of Kings, suggesting that service to Yahweh was equivalent to serving the ultimate cosmic God, sometimes even referencing Platonic concepts like the Timaeus to explain creation.
And Christian thinkers picked up on some of these strategies.
Yes, Christian apologists later absorbed and adapted some of these Hellenistic Jewish arguments for their own purposes, as scholars like Eric Peterson showed.
Which leads us to Eusebius of Caesarea, the great theologian associated with Emperor Constantine.
Eusebius is a key figure because he developed perhaps the first comprehensive Christian political theology for the Roman Empire. He famously argued that the rise of the empire under Augustus, establishing the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was not an accident, but part of God's providential plan. This universal peace created the conditions necessary for the rapid spread of the Christian gospel throughout the known world.
So he saw the empire as serving God's purpose.
Yes. He even politicized certain Old Testament prophecies about universal peace, interpreting the peace of the Lord as being historically realized, at least partially, in the Pax Romana. And he lavishly praised Constantine, portraying him as God's chosen instrument on earth, imitating the monarchy of the one God in heaven through his own sole rule, Basilius, over the empire. Eusebius provides a prime example of how Christian truth was ultimately integrated into and used to legitimize the framework of Roman imperial existential representation.
Okay, let's try to summarize the whole of Section 3 now, the struggle for representation in the Roman Empire.
All right, the big picture for Rome. First, it was the arena for a major struggle between truths. Primarily the anthropological truth of Greco-Roman philosophy versus the soteriological truth of Christianity, with its unique experiences of grace. Amicitia. First, it was the arena for a major struggle between truths. Second, Christianity's victory led to it becoming the new civil theology. But as critics like Celsus foresaw, this involved dismantling the old pagan civilizational order. Figures like Augustine shaped the ideal of the Christian ruler, Imperator Felix, but were perhaps blind to the coercive aspect of imposing this new truth. First, it was the arena for a major struggle between truths. Third, the Roman Principate itself represented a new form of existential representation, evolving out of the social structure of the patronate and solidified by empire-wide clientele oaths to the emperor. First, it was the arena for a major struggle between truths. Fourth, the Edict of Toleration was likely motivated, at least partly, by a pragmatic Roman fear of the Christian god's perceived power. Dode principio. First, it was the arena for a major struggle between truths. Fifth, thinkers like Eusebius developed a political theology that integrated the Roman Empire into Christian history, seeing the Pax Romana as providential and the emperor as God's representative, thus legitimizing the imperial order in Christian terms.
So Christianity wins, becomes the dominant truth represented by the empire. This leads, Voegelin says, to a de-divinization of the purely political or temporal sphere compared to the old cosmic empires, where the ruler was divine or directly represented cosmic forces. But then comes modernity. And Voegelin makes the striking claim that modernity is marked by a re-divinization. How does that work?
Yes, that's a central and maybe startling part of his argument. Modernity involves a re-divinization, but, and this is absolutely crucial, it's not a return to classical paganism. That's a common mischaracterization, he thinks.
So it's not about reviving Jupiter or Apollo.
No. Voegelin argues forcefully that the origins of this modern redivinization lie within the Christian tradition itself. Specifically, they stem from components of Christianity that were suppressed or declared heretical early on, particularly movements broadly labeled as Gnosticism.
Gnosticism. I've heard the term often related to early Christian controversies. How does Voegelin use it here in relation to modernity?
He sees Gnosticism not just as an ancient phenomenon, but as a recurring structure of thought and experience that erupts powerfully in the modern West. He points to a fascinating figure, Joima Flora, a 12th century Italian abbot, as someone who created symbolic structures that became immensely influential, laying the groundwork for modern political self-understanding.
A 12th century monk influencing modern politics. What did Joachim do?
Joachim developed a highly original interpretation of history based on the Trinity. He applied the symbol of the Trinity to the unfolding course of time, proposing 3 great ages. First, the age of the Father, associated with the Old Testament fear, the married state layman, symbolized by Abraham. Second, the age of the Son, New Testament faith, the clerical state, active contemplation, symbolized by Christ. And third, a coming age of the Holy Spirit. This would be a new final dispensation characterized by love, spiritual understanding. The monastic life is the ideal, a life of perfect spiritual freedom.
A third age.
Yes, and he believed this third age was imminent. He even made calculations, predicting it might begin around the year 1260. He also prophesied that this new age would be ushered in by a new order of spiritual men, and possibly led by a figure he called the Duxi Babylon, a leader emerging from the Babylon of worldly corruption to inaugurate the final spiritual era.
Okay, that's quite a vision. And Voegelin claims these ideas, the 3 ages, the coming third realm, became foundational symbols for modernity.
Absolutely. He identifies several key symbols derived from Joachim's system that he argues still govern how modern political society understands itself, often unconsciously. The first, and perhaps most pervasive, is precisely the symbol of the 3 ages, culminating in a final, perfect third realm.
Where do we see that pattern?
Variations pop up everywhere in modern historical periodization and political ideologies. You see it in the humanist and Enlightenment division of history into ancient, medieval, and modern. In Turgot's and Comte's stages, theological, metaphysical, and positive scientific. In Turgot's and Comte's stages. In Hegel's philosophy of history, with its 3 stages of the realization of freedom. Most famously, perhaps, in Marx's historical materialism. primitive communism, followed by the long era of class society, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, culminating in the final realm of communism, most famously perhaps in Marx's historical materialism, and even in a debased form in the National Socialist ideology of the Third Reich.
Wow, that's a striking connection across seemingly very different ideologies. What were the other Joachitic symbols Voegelin identifies?
The second key symbol is the leader or prophet of the New Age. If history has an inner logic driving it towards a final, perfect state, then understanding that logic requires special insight. Someone is needed a prophet, an intellectual, a revolutionary leader who possesses this special knowledge, gnosis, and can guide humanity into the Third Age. Joachim himself, claiming a unique ability to interpret the hidden meaning of Scripture, becomes the prototype for this figure.
So the modern intellectual or revolutionary leader claiming unique insight into history's direction is prefigured here.
That's Voegelin's argument. The third symbol is closely related, sometimes blending with the second, the prophet who announces the meaning of history and the coming new age. And the fourth symbol is the vision of a future brotherhood of autonomous persons.
What does that mean?
In Joachim's conception of the age of the spirit, human beings would achieve spiritual perfection directly, without needing the mediation of the Church's sacraments or hierarchy. The Holy Spirit would dwell in everyone. Charismatic gifts would become universal. As a result, the institutional church as it existed would cease to be necessary, replaced by a community, a brotherhood of spiritually perfected, autonomous individuals living in freedom and love.
You mentioned the National Socialist Third Reich specifically. How did that connect back to Joachim?
Voegelin notes it's a complex lineage. The idea certainly derived from this Joachitic speculation about a third realm, but it was mediated through various later streams of thought, perhaps Anabaptist movements, German idealists like Fichte, Hegel, Schelling. Its specific, rather flat or provincial nationalistic character, he suggests, came partly through literary transfer, particularly from Arthur Müller of Vandenbroek's 1923 book Das Dritte Reich, which itself drew some inspiration from Dostoevsky's quite different concept of the Russian Third Rome.
Okay, tell us more about that Russian Third Rome idea. It sounds related but distinct.
It is related in its blend of spiritual eschatology and political claims, but with a unique Russian context. The idea, most famously articulated by the monk Philofey of Pskov in the early 16th century, was that the first Rome, Rome itself, had fallen into heresy, according to the Orthodox view. The second Rome, Constantinople, had fallen to the Turks, and therefore Moscow was the third, final, and eternal Rome, the last bastion of true Orthodox Christianity, and the heir to the universal Christian empire.
And this wasn't just a fringe idea. It became central to Russia's self-understanding.
Absolutely fundamental. It was formally institutionalized. Ivan IV, the Terrible, was crowned Tsar Caesar in 1547, explicitly claiming this Roman imperial heritage. Later, in 1589, the Russian Orthodox Church was granted its own patriarchate, formally recognized by the Eastern Patriarchs as occupying the position of the Third Rome.
And this happened around the same time Western Europe was consolidating into nation-states and going through the Reformation.
Yes, the timing is significant. Russia wasn't forming itself as a nation-state in the Western sense. It was constituting itself as a unique civilizational area defined by this powerful symbol of Roman-Byzantine continuation.
Did this unique self-understanding affect Russia's political development compared to the West?
Profoundly, Voegelin argues. Russia developed a sui generis, a unique type of representation, both transcendental, representing the Third Rome, the bastion of orthodoxy, and existential. This development path was radically cut off from the emerging Western representative institutions like parliaments, estates, partly because of Russia's internal social rearticulation. Under rulers like Ivan the Terrible, the old feudal nobility was suppressed and replaced by a service nobility entirely dependent on the Tsar. This solidified the Tsar as the absolute existential representative, preventing the kind of articulation between ruler and relatively autonomous social groups that occurred in the West.
So Western attempts to integrate Russia into their political system didn't work.
No. Voegelin mentions attempts by Holy Roman emperors like Maximilian III and XXX to draw Russia into the Western orbit, perhaps by offering Ivan the Great a royal crown or Ivan I an imperial one. These offers were refused. The Tsars saw their authority deriving directly from God and their unique Third Rome destiny, not from Western recognition. Even Napoleon, much later, recognized the fundamental distinction, seeing Russia and the Occident, the West, as the two dominant but distinct powers.
And even Peter the Great's famous Westernization didn't fundamentally change this deep structure.
Not according to Voegelin. Peter's reforms were revolutionary in many ways, forcibly introducing Western technology, administration, and court culture, especially among the high nobility. But they didn't alter the underlying social articulation or the autocratic structure of existential representation. Russia didn't develop Western-style political institutions or a politically independent society as a result. Even much later, thinkers like Dostoevsky continued to articulate a vision of Russia's unique spiritual destiny, seeing it as the nation destined to represent Christ to the world.
So these powerful symbolic frameworks, Joachim's Third Age, the Russian Third Rome, they weren't just abstract ideas. They became potent forces shaping political reality, acting almost like new kinds of civil theology.
Exactly. Gnostic movements, inspired by these kinds of symbols, become crucial players in modern history. They offer comprehensive interpretations of existence, claim unique access to truth, and provide a powerful, often messianic impetus for political action aimed at transforming the world according to their vision. They function, in essence, as alternative civil theologies competing with or seeking to replace traditional religious and political orders.
What then is the absolute core of this gnosis? What's the experience behind it?
This is key. Voegelin emphasizes that gnosis isn't just an intellectual system or a set of doctrines. At its heart, it's a living religious culture, driven by a specific kind of experience. It's an experience that claims to offer a firmer grip on transcendence, a more direct and certain knowledge of ultimate reality than is available through traditional faith, cognitio fide.
How does it claim to get this firmer grip?
Through what Voegelin describes as an expansion of the soul, but a problematic one. It's an attempt where the transcendent, where God, is, in a sense, drawn into the existence of man. Instead of man orienting himself towards a transcendent God, the Gnostic attempts to pull the divine into himself to possess or merge with it directly.
It's an attempt by humans to divinize themselves.
That's the core dynamic. It's an attempt to achieve salvation or ultimate knowledge through one's own efforts, through a special insight or experience, bypassing the perceived uncertainties and limitations of traditional faith and sacramental mediation.
And this core experience can manifest in different ways, leading to different types of gnosis.
Yes. Voegelin suggests we can distinguish different types based on which human faculty becomes the predominant vehicle for this attempt to draw God into man. There's intellectual gnosis. This is primarily speculative. The Gnostic believes they can grasp the ultimate secrets of reality and history through their own intellect, through a comprehensive philosophical system. Think of figures like Hegel or Schelling, whose systems claim to map out the entire structure of being and history. Then there's emotional gnosis. Here, the emphasis is on feeling, on experiencing the divine substance directly within oneself, achieving a sense of inner illumination or union. This is often found in leaders of enthusiastic or paracletic sects who claim a special indwelling of the spirit. Finally, there's volitional gnosis. This is the activist form. The Gnostic believes that redemption, or the transformation of reality, can be achieved through human will and action, through imposing a specific plan or order onto the world. Think of figures like Auguste Comte with his positivist plan for society, or Marx with the revolutionary action of the proletariat, or even Hitler with the imposition of the National Socialist racial ideology.
So these different forms, intellectual, emotional, volitional, are all variations on this fundamental Gnostic impulse to achieve self-divinization by pulling transcendence into the human sphere.
Yes. These experiences, in their various forms, are the very core of the modern redivinization Voegelin talks about. It's men divinizing themselves by substituting these intense, often overwhelming inward modes of participating in perceived divinity for the structure of traditional Christian faith, which emphasizes humility, grace, and the otherness of God.
Okay, let's pause for a micro recap covering Gnosticism and the nature of modernity. So Voegelin argues modernity's characteristic redivinization doesn't come from paganism, but from suppressed Gnostic elements within the Christian tradition itself. A key figure is Joachim of Flora, who provided hugely influential symbols. The three ages culminating in a third realm, the necessity of a Gnostic leader-prophet, and the vision of a brotherhood of autonomous persons. These symbols deeply shape modern political self-understanding, both in the West and in related forms like the Russian Third Rome. The core of gnosis is the experience of trying to draw God into man, seeking a certainty beyond faith, leading to varieties based on which faculty dominates, intellectual, emotional, or volitional.
And understanding these underlying Gnostic experiences, Voegelin argues, allows us to see a kind of inner logic connecting the seemingly diverse phenomena of Western political development over the last several centuries. It helps explain the trajectory from the immanentist tendencies already present in the late Middle Ages through the various movements we often label as secular humanism, the Enlightenment, progressivism, liberalism, positivism, right up to the most radical forms like Marxism.
So these movements, despite their obvious differences and conflicts on the surface, share a kind of family resemblance at this deeper experiential level. They're all variations on this Gnostic theme.
That's the claim. The substance of history, for Voegelin, isn't just a sequence of ideas or events, it's driven by these fundamental human experiences. Gnostic movements might clash furiously on the intellectual level, think liberals versus Marxists, but they often share this underlying experiential core, the drive to find ultimate meaning and achieve salvation or perfection within the confines of history and human potential.
And why is modern secularism seen as even more radical than earlier forms?
Because, Voegelin suggests, the underlying experiential divinization of man becomes more explicit and more radical. Earlier forms might have tried to bring the kingdom of God to earth, but later secular forms effectively eliminate the transcendent God altogether and locate divinity entirely within humanity itself.
Like Feuerbach and Marx arguing God is just a projection.
Exactly. That marks a crucial turning point. For Feuerbach, then Marx, transcendent God is understood as an alienation, a projection of man's own highest qualities onto an imaginary being. The decisive Gnostic move, then, is for man to reclaim that projection, to draw divinity back into himself, recognizing that he is the source of value, that he is God. This act of reclaiming divinity transfigures man into the Superman.
The Marxian Superman who masters history and creates the final communist utopia.
Yes. The Superman represents the logical endpoint, the extreme conclusion of this Gnostic trajectory of self-salvation and self-divinization. It goes even beyond earlier figures like the Godhead man found in some strands of Affirmation mysticism.
And this origin within and transformation of Christian concepts is why these modern movements are fundamentally different from a simple return to paganism.
Precisely. Paganism didn't typically have this intense focus on historical progress towards a final goal, nor this radical drive towards human self-divinization born from reacting against or transforming Christian concepts of sin, grace, and transcendence. The Gnostic trajectory is specific to the post-Christian West.
Voegelin is also very clear about the dangerous consequences of this whole Gnostic outlook, especially its tendency to disregard the actual principles of existence.
Yes, because Gnosticism, in its drive to immanentize the eschaton, to force the ultimate perfect end state into the here and now, inevitably operates based on what Voegelin calls a dream world. It constructs a fundamentally false picture of reality, one that ignores or denies the inherent limitations, uncertainties, and tragic dimensions of human existence and time.
And this isn't just an intellectual error. It has real damaging consequences.
Deeply damaging, even what he calls pneumopathological results, pathologies of the spirit.
Psychospiritual pathology. That sounds serious.
It is. He argues it leads to a systematic attack on the dianoetic virtues. The intellectual virtues identified by Aristotle, like wisdom, Sophia, and practical wisdom or prudence, phronesis, which are necessary for clear thinking and navigating reality effectively. Instead, Gnosticism often promotes what he starkly calls moral insanity.
Moral insanity? What does he mean by that?
It's a powerful term. He defines its symptoms as things like a blatant disregard for the actual structure of reality, willful ignorance, especially of history, the constant assertion of irresponsible opinions based solely on subjective conviction or feeling rather than evidence or reason, philosophical illiteracy combined with arrogance, a kind of spiritual dullness or deafness to deeper truths, and often a glib agnostic sophistication that dismisses fundamental questions as meaningless.
And this fundamental disregard for reality, this moral insanity, inevitably leads to conflict.
Absolutely. If political actors are operating based on a fundamentally false dream world picture of reality and human nature, their actions will inevitably clash with the way things actually are. This creates constant friction, misunderstanding, and ultimately, conflict. It makes genuine, lasting peace impossible because the Gnostic project itself is often predicated on achieving a final victory over perceived enemies who represent the old order or false consciousness.
Okay, let's try to pull together the key points from this section on Gnosticism and the nature of modernity.
Right, Section 4 summary. Modernity isn't pagan revival, but Gnostic redivinization, originating within Christianity. Joachim of Flora symbols, three ages, third realm, leader prophet, brotherhood, are foundational for modern political self-understanding, West and Russia's third realm. The Gnostic experience is core. trying to draw God into man for certainty power, manifesting in intellectual, emotional, or volitional forms. The Gnostic experience is core. This explains the logic of Western development towards radical immanentism, secularism, Marxism, Superman. Gnosticism creates a dream world by immanentizing the eschaton, leading to pneumopathology, attacking intellectual virtues, promoting moral insanity, disregarding reality, causing conflict.
That sets a rather dramatic stage.
Yeah.
Now let's see how Voegelin analyzes this Gnostic impulse playing out in a specific pivotal historical event, the Puritan Revolution in England.
So Voegelin starts this section by questioning our standard historical timelines. He points out that the conventional way we often divide history, putting a big break around 1500 for the start of modernity, is itself often based on Gnostic assumptions.
How so?
Because it reflects that Joechitic idea of a third realm. Thinkers like Flavio Biondo in the Renaissance, who first popularized the ancient medieval-modern division, were implicitly, maybe unconsciously, adopting this Gnostic pattern where their own time becomes the dawn of the final enlightened age. Each subsequent Gnostic wave tends to claim it represents the truly new age, the definitive break with the past.
So if you just rely on the Gnostics' own claims about starting a new era, you can't really establish an objective historical periodization. You're just adopting their propaganda.
That's the problem he sees. You lack a stable, critical reference point. So Voegelin suggests that periodization becomes genuinely meaningful, not based on the claims, but on the results. Specifically, when Gnosticism achieves a decisive revolutionary victory at the level of existential representation.
Meaning when a Gnostic movement actually succeeds in taking over the core institutions that represent and govern a society.
Exactly. That's when you have a real epical shift, driven by the successful imposition of a Gnostic worldview onto the political structure.
And for Western history, he identifies the Reformation as that critical moment.
Yes. The Reformation, in Voegelin's quite provocative analysis, marks the successful invasion of Western institutions by Gnostic movements. He argues that movements with Gnostic characteristics, which had previously existed on the margins or been suppressed as heresies, erupted with new force. They shattered the unity of the medieval church and, crucially, began the process of conquering the institutions of the emerging national states.
And to analyze this process in action, he turns to Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, written right in the middle of the English Civil War, which was heavily driven by Puritan Gnosticism.
Right. Hobbes provides a fascinating, though complex, diagnosis of the Puritan Revolution, precisely because he's trying to understand the forces tearing England apart. Hobbes's method is starkly modern. He starts with a psychological analysis of human nature, grounding it in the fundamental drives of passions, appetites, desires, and aversions, fears. He explicitly rejects the classical and Christian starting point of a summum bonum, a highest good, a shared purpose like virtue or salvation that could naturally order human life.
So if Hobbes says there's no common highest purpose that people agree on, how can you possibly build a stable society? Where does order come from?
That's the absolute core of Hobbes's problem. If order can't arise from striving towards a shared good, it must be imposed by the avoidance of the greatest evil. And for Hobbes, the greatest evil, the summa mamum, is the fear of violent death, especially in a state of nature where life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
So it's mutual fear, the fear of death, that drives people into society.
Yes. Fear motivates individuals to give up their natural right to everything and submit to a sovereign power through a social covenant or contract. But Hobbes describes this as something more profound than just a rational agreement. It's a kind of psychological transformation where individuals effectively merge their conflicting power drives into a single artificial entity, the Commonwealth, personified by the sovereign.
He had a very specific, almost legalistic definition of a person that's key here.
Yes. He distinguishes between a natural person, someone whose words and actions are their own, and an artificial person, someone whose words and actions represent another. In the creation of the Commonwealth, the multitude of individuals authorize a sovereign to act as their artificial person. Their individual wills and passions are fused into this one person carried by the sovereign. Hobbes insists this is more than consent or concord. It is a real unity of them all.
And this artificial person, the Commonwealth embodied by the sovereign, is the great Leviathan, the mortal god.
Precisely. That's his famous image. The sovereign, the Leviathan, is the mortal god who, by wielding overwhelming power and inspiring terror, Midas, shapes the wills of the subjects towards peace and common defense. Hobbes's logic is brutal. If human nature is fundamentally just uncontrolled passion, without an intrinsic ordering principle like reason, logos, or divine grace...
If people can't govern themselves internally.
Right. And if human pride, amor sui, self-love, cannot be restrained by a sense of justice, Dike, or redeemed by the love of God, amor Dei, then it must be broken and controlled by the sheer external power of the terrifying sovereign. The Leviathan is, as the quote from Job used by Hobbes suggests, the king over all the children of pride. If souls cannot participate in the ordering logos, then the terrifying sovereign becomes the necessary essence of the commonwealth.
And Hobbes wasn't just describing this, he was actually trying to establish a new kind of unquestionable basis for order in England, a new civil theology.
That certainly seems to be his intention. He argues strongly that the sovereign must control public doctrine, and he attempts to interpret Christianity in a way that makes it compatible with, indeed identical to, his laws of nature derived from fear and reason. He essentially wants his version of natural law, backed by scripture, interpreted his way, to function as an English theologia civilis in that old Roman Veronic sense, the ultimate state-enforced truth that ends debilitating religious and political disputes.
But Voegelin argues Hobbes's whole project is flawed because he misunderstands the nature of Christian truth.
Yes, Voegelin sees a parallel here. Hobbes, he argues, was fundamentally insensitive to Christianity as a truth of the soul, as an experiential reality involving faith, grace, and transcendence. He treated it primarily as a set of doctrines that could be manipulated or reinterpreted to serve the needs of political order. This mirrors, in reverse, the blind spot Voegelin attributed to figures like St. Augustine, who were arguably insensitive to Roman paganism as a truth of society, as the symbolic system that gave coherence to that specific community.
So both sides, in a way, failed to grasp the full picture.
Both tried to impose their preferred truth, whether Hobbes's rational state or Augustine's revealed faith, onto the whole structure by force, assuming it must function as the single unifying civil theology, without adequately acknowledging the inherent and perhaps permanent tension between these different dimensions of truth.
You mentioned this tension earlier, the tension between the truth of society, its public order, its binding symbols, and the truth of the soul, the individual's differentiated experience of transcendence. Voegelin sees this as a permanent structure of reality.
Yes. He emphasizes that the opening of the soul, the differentiation of consciousness achieved through philosophy and Christian revelation, was a monumental epoch in human experience in how reality could be perceived and understood. But it didn't change the underlying structure of reality itself. The fundamental tension between the requirements of social order, which often relies on more compact, shared symbols and myths, a civil theology, and the requirements of the fully differentiated soul, oriented towards transcendent truth, existed before Christianity and philosophy, and it remains a permanent structural problem, a permanent challenge in human existence.
Plato wrestled with this too.
Definitely. Voegelin suggests Plato's own development shows this. He moves from the radical solution proposed in the Republic, where the tension is ideally dissolved by making the order of the philosopher's soul the direct order of society, to the more pragmatic, mediating approach in his later work, The Laws, where society reflects cosmic order, and the truth of the soul is mediated through carefully constructed laws and dogma, acknowledging the limits of philosophy for the masses.
So, how did Hobbes fail in navigating this tension?
Hobbes brilliantly recognized the need for a stable civil theology, for a public truth beyond endless debate, to prevent society from dissolving into chaos. That's the great achievement of Leviathan as a diagnosis. But he failed in his prescription, Voegelin argues, because he tried to make his specific interpretation of Christianity identical with his rationally constructed truth of society, the order based on fear. He effectively denied the independent validity of the truth of the soul and the tension between it and societal order.
And this unresolved tension, this attempt to suppress one side, opens the door for Gnostic movements like the Puritans to exploit the situation.
Precisely. When the delicate balance or tension between the truth of society and the truth of the soul is broken, or when one is used to suppress the other, the repressed element tends to reappear in distorted forms. Gnostic movements, like the Puritans in this context, emerge as new, militant theologiae civiles. They offer their own Gnostic truth as the solution, seeking to impose it on society, often characterized, Voegelin argues, by a further repression of the authentic truth of the soul, which they see as incompatible with their imminent, world-transforming goals.
To understand the Puritans specifically, Voegelin looks closely at the analysis done by Richard Hooker much earlier.
Yes, Hooker, the great Anglican theologian writing in the late 16th century, provides a remarkably astute analysis of Puritan methods and psychology in his Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. Hooker observed their tactics firsthand.
What were those tactics, according to Hooker?
Hooker outlines a pattern. First, they skillfully exploit existing social discontent and grievances. Second, they promise a simple sovereign remedy, typically, a radical restructuring of church government, which implies a restructuring of society. Third, they intensively use scripture, interpreted in their specific way, to fashion and frame the minds of potential followers. Fourth, they bolster their interpretations by claiming special illumination of the Holy Ghost, suggesting their understanding comes directly from God, bypassing traditional authority and reason. And fifth, this creates a sharp division between the initiated, the brethren, the self-proclaimed elect, and everyone else, the worldlings, who just don't get it.
And this claim of special divine insight makes rational debate utterly impossible, doesn't it?
Exactly. As Hooker experienced, you couldn't effectively argue with people who believed their position was directly revealed by God. Any appeal to reason, tradition, or established authority was dismissed. Voegelin highlights a fascinating note where Hooker quotes the medieval philosopher Averroes. The quote suggests that profound divine knowledge is inherently dangerous if treated as simple dogma for the masses. Public disputation can destroy its divinity for the vulgar and should be reserved for the wise. Hooker seems to imply the Puritans are violating this principle, dangerously simplifying and dogmatizing spiritual mysteries for political ends.
What was Hooker's ultimate conclusion about the danger posed by the Puritans?
He saw the greatest danger lay in their willingness to potentially turn the world clean upside down in the name of their supposedly divine truth. Hooker strongly defended the idea that government represents the established order and truth of the whole society, not just the desires of its individual subjects or factions. Public consent, embodied in established laws and institutions, should generally overrule private judgment, especially when that judgment claims a revolutionary mandate. Therefore, the government has a fundamental duty to preserve the existing order and truth against such challenges. It should not abdicate its authority to Gnostic leaders claiming a higher mandate from God or later from progress, race, or the dialectic.
This sounds very relevant to modern debates about the limits of tolerance in a democracy.
It absolutely connects. Voegelin explicitly invokes Justice Robert Jackson's famous line about the U.S. Bill of Rights not being a suicide pact. The point is that even a constitutional democratic government shouldn't be obligated to facilitate its own destruction by granting unlimited freedom to movements fundamentally committed to overthrowing that constitutional order. If a Gnostic movement poses an existential threat, the government, representing the whole society, may have a duty to resist it, even if that means taking actions that seem to conflict with the letter of its own laws in order to preserve the spirit of the Constitution and the existence of the society itself.
To get a more concrete feel for the Puritan Gnostic program, Voegelin analyzes some of their actual pamphlets from the Revolutionary period.
Yes, he looks closely at a 1641 pamphlet titled A Glimpse of Sion's Glory. It's a powerful piece of Gnostic propaganda. It boldly asserts that God is now choosing to work through the common and ignorant sort of people, the vulgar multitude, rather than the established elites, the nobility, gentry, or church hierarchy, who are often denounced as representing Antichrist.
So a complete inversion of the social order is seen as God's plan.
Yes. The despised saints, the brethren, often poor and unlearned, are destined to become the best Commonwealth's men. The pamphlet quotes Isaiah, "Kings shall be thy nursing fathers," to suggest that worldly rulers will eventually bow down and serve the saints. The saints themselves will be glorified, clothed in white linen, symbolizing their purity and future rule.
And did this vision include a transformation of material life as well?
Oh, absolutely. The pamphlet hints that in the coming kingdom of the saints, traditional legal compulsion might become unnecessary because of the direct presence of Christ among them. And crucially, it anticipates earthly abundance and prosperity for the saints. All is yours, even this world bodily. The argument is made that since Christ purchased the world for the saints through his sacrifice, and since the saints are currently poor and oppressed, it logically follows that the world shall be theirs in a very tangible material sense.
That definitely doesn't sound like traditional Christian teachings about detachment from worldly goods or the kingdom being not of this world.
No, and Voegelin emphasizes this point strongly. This, he argues, is not Christianity, despite the heavy use of biblical language and imagery. It's Gnosticism wearing scriptural camouflage. It perfectly reflects the core Gnostic desire to immanentize the eschaton, to bring about the final state of perfection and transfiguration within history through the actions of the self-proclaimed saints who believe they are doing God's work directly. Human efforts become central, even if attributed to God's will. God's action isn't awaited patiently. He is expected to come skipping over mountains, as the pamphlet says. Voegelin sees this as analogous to later ideas about the inevitable rapid dialectics of history bringing about the revolution.
He also examines another document, the Gnostic Program Queries from 1649, which shows an even more concrete revolutionary plan.
Yes, this document consists of questions or queries addressed directly to the leaders of Cromwell's New Model Army, the Lord General Fairfax, and the Council of War. It asks about the present interest of the saints and people of God. The proposed program is startlingly clear. The saints should first associate in local church societies, congregational model, then combine these into larger bodies, Presbyterian model, with the ultimate aim of taking power to rule the nations and kingdoms of the world.
Rule the nations and kingdoms of the world. That's an explicit call for the saints to take global power.
It is, and Voegelin raises the disturbing question. Who exactly are these nations and kingdoms they intend to rule over? Since the saints presumably consider themselves already living in the new age or kingdom of Christ, the people they aim to rule must be the outsiders, the worldlings. He suggests this structure looks chillingly like a precursor to later totalitarian concepts, perhaps most notably the Leninist idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat, where a vanguard elite, the saints, the party, claims the right to rule absolutely over everyone else in the name of historical destiny or divine mandate.
So the Puritan Revolution wasn't just about replacing one set of rulers, king and bishops, with another, parliament and presbyters, but involved a much more radical shift in the underlying spirit and justification of rule.
Exactly. The queries explicitly distinguish between ruling as officers of Christ and ruling as mere Christian magistrates representing the old worldly order. The new rule of the Spirit, embodied by the saints and their assemblies, is seen as destined to put down the old forms of worldly rule. It's presented as a struggle between two types of truth, darkness versus light. A Puritan victory, even if it retains some outward forms like Parliament, would represent a radical transformation in the animating spirit and, crucially, the ruling personnel of the political order.
Because ruling as an officer of Christ was seen as superior.
Far superior. The query suggests it's a much greater honor to rule as representatives of Christ and the churches than merely as officers of a worldly state representing the natural, unregenerate people. The clear implication is that the old ruling groups, those tied to the worldly order, must be removed and replaced by the saints.
Okay, let's try to summarize Section 5, the Gnostic Revolution and the Puritan case.
To recap the Puritan case study, first, the Reformation itself marks a crucial epoch, the successful invasion of Western institutions by Gnostic movements. First, the Reformation itself marks a crucial epoch. Second, Hobbes's Leviathan provides a diagnosis of the revolution's chaos, grounding order in fear of death and proposing the mortal God state. His attempt at a civil theology failed because it denied the tension between truth of society and truth of soul. First, the Reformation itself marks a crucial epoch. Third, Puritan Gnosticism functioned as a new militant civil theology, characterized by the repression of the soul's truth. Fourth, Hooker's analysis revealed Puritan tactics, exploiting discontent, promising cures, using scripture selectively, claiming special illumination, dividing society, saints, worldlings, making debate impossible. Hooker stressed the government's duty to resist such Gnostic claims. Fifth, Puritan pamphlets, A Glimpse, Queries, reveal their program, immanentizing the eschaton, saints inheriting the earth materially, aiming for saints to rule the world, foreshadowing concepts like the dictatorship of the proletariat, and involving a radical change in the animating spirit and personnel and rule.
That detailed look at the Puritan Revolution really brings Voegelin's concept of Gnostic politics to life. It leads us directly into his final section, where he reflects on the broader implications and potential end results of this Gnostic trend in modernity.
Yes, in this final chapter, Voegelin draws some stark conclusions about where this dominance of Gnosticism in modern politics leads. He reiterates a key point. Modern Gnosticism, when it functions as a society's effective civil theology, doesn't just cause a forgetting or a simple return to the more compact, undifferentiated consciousness of pre-philosophical or pre-Christian times. It does something worse.
Worse than just forgetting.
Yes, it actively represses the differentiated truth of the soul, the understanding of human existence in relation to transcendence that was achieved through centuries of philosophical and spiritual effort.
And what is the political consequence of actively repressing that fundamental source of order within the human soul?
He connects it directly to the horrifying realities of 20th century totalitarianism. The bleak atrocity, his words shown by totalitarian governments towards individual human beings, their disregard for human dignity and spiritual life, stems precisely from this ideological repression of the soul's truth, which is the ultimate authoritative source of genuine order. When the inner source is denied, only external coercion remains.
He then introduces a very grand, almost cosmic perspective here, this idea of a vast civilizational cycle spanning world history.
He does. It's a way to place modernity within a much larger historical and spiritual context. He conceives of a giant world historic Advent-recession cycle.
Advent and recession. What's the peak, the central point of this cycle?
For Voegelin, the historical acme, the point of maximum differentiation in human understanding of reality and the relationship between God and man, is the appearance of Christ. This represents the clearest experiential articulation of the truth of the soul and its transcendent destiny.
Okay, so that's the peak. What's the Advent part, the ascending branch?
That comprises the great pre-Christian high civilizations. He sees their spiritual and philosophical development as moving towards this peak. They progress from earlier states of compact mythological experience towards the increasing differentiation of the soul as the sensorium of transcendence, the faculty through which transcendent reality is perceived and understood. The dynamics of this phase are adventitious, characterized by the advent of truth into clearer focus.
Which means modern Gnostic civilization fits onto the other side.
Exactly. Modern civilization, particularly as characterized by the rise and spread of Gnosticism, represents the descending branch, the recessive phase of this grand cycle. It marks a turning away, a recession, from the maximum differentiation achieved with the regulation embodied in Christ and the philosophical articulation of the soul. Western society, therefore, while having its own internal cycles of rise and fall, finds its place within this larger pattern primarily on the declining slope because of the growing influence of Gnosticism.
That's a profoundly sobering perspective to see our entire modern era as potentially characterized by a spiritual recession.
It is indeed. And this perspective is directly linked to what he identifies as the second major danger inherent in Gnosticism, connected to the first danger, the destruction of the soul's truth.
Okay, beyond destroying the soul's truth, what is this second fundamental danger?
It's the practical consequence of the core Gnostic theoretical error, the fallacy of immanentizing the eschaton. Remember, that's the attempt to bring about the ultimate, perfect condition, heaven, utopia, the end of history within the confines of historical time and human action. This isn't just an abstract philosophical mistake. It gets applied to concrete societies, leading Gnostic movements to construct and operate based on a fundamentally false picture of reality.
And acting politically based on a false map of reality inevitably leads to disaster.
Inevitably. Political actions derived from this false conception will constantly clash with the actual structure of existence, leading to failure, violence, and suffering. Moreover, Voegelin argues, this Gnostic outlook actively destroys what he calls the oldest wisdom of mankind concerning the rhythm of growth and decay.
The wisdom found in texts like Ecclesiastes.
Exactly. The hard-won wisdom, expressed in figures like Kohelet, the author of Ecclesiastes, about the inescapable realities of temporal existence, the cycles of life and death, success and failure, joy and sorrow, fortuna secunda et adversa, the understanding that all things under the sun have their season, that human power and ambition have limits, that perfect fulfillment is not to be found within history itself.
Gnosticism's dream world denies these fundamental limits and rhythms.
Completely. It promises an escape from the uncertainties and tragedies of existence, offering the allure of a final, permanent state of perfection achievable here and now. Voegelin notes the psychological appeal of this. The demonic horror of facing existence without guaranteed success, without absolute meaning provided by reason or right, is hard for many people, especially tender souls, to bear. They cannot bear not believing that their existence, their group, their project deserves to succeed and endure permanently.
And even whole societies can fall prey to this resistance against the wisdom of limits.
Oh, absolutely. He observes that societies, especially successful ones with long histories, naturally tend to take their own existence for granted. They easily slip into extending the meaning and perceived permanence of their own specific order onto the very fact of their existence, making their potential decline or fall seem almost unimaginable. Think of the profound shock throughout the Roman world. When Rome itself was sacked in 410 AD, it shattered this illusion of permanence.
Does Voegelin suggest there's any inherent weakness in Gnosticism, given its basis in a false reality?
Yes, he argues that precisely because its picture of reality is false, Gnosticism contains within itself a self-defeating factor. Actions based on false premises are ultimately unsustainable. Therefore, the eventual implosion or self-destruction of Gnostic political projects is highly probable, even if the specific timing, the date, as he puts it, is unpredictable. Reality tends to assert itself in the end, often catastrophically.
Writing in the early 1950s at the height of the Cold War, he explicitly connects the contemporary communist danger to what he calls Western paralysis. How does he see that link?
He saw the threat of communism not just as an external military or geopolitical challenge posed by the Soviet Union. He viewed it as intrinsically linked to the internal spiritual and intellectual condition of Western societies themselves. Why? Because Western societies, in his view, were already deeply infected with various forms of the Gnostic dream.
So the West was vulnerable because it shared some of the same underlying Gnostic assumptions.
Yes. He talks about the tendency of political discourse to slide from the right to the left, meaning a drift towards more radical forms of immanentist ideology. This drift is inherent in the Gnostic mindset, he argues, because communism often presents itself as simply a more radical, more consistent, more scientifically grounded version of the same basic Gnostic project of achieving earthly salvation through historical transformation. It possesses a powerful logique du cœur, a compelling emotional and volitional logic for those already caught within the Gnostic dream.
And this shared ground leads to paralysis in the West response.
Exactly. Western societies, permeated by their own right-wing or moderate forms of Gnosticism, like belief in inevitable progress or technocratic solutions to human problems, find themselves intellectually and morally paralyzed when confronting the more radical left-wing Gnosticism of communism. To mount a fundamental critique of communism's Gnostic premises would require them to also critique and dismantle the Gnostic elements within their own cultures and ideologies. And that's a massive, painful undertaking, requiring a fundamental shift in consciousness that likely takes generations.
So the core of the crisis of civilization, as Voegelin saw it then and perhaps still relevant now, lies in the state of our public discourse, the way we think and talk about reality.
Precisely. He lays out the stark condition required for the latent dangers of Gnosticism, like the communist threat he was focused on, to actually cease being a major danger. The public debate, the climate of opinion, must stop being dominated by Gnostic cliches and assumptions.
And what is the practical effect of these dominant Gnostic cliches on public life?
He describes a devastating inversion of values, things that are essential for a healthy civilization, like a serious effort to understand reality. The cultivation of intellectual virtues like wisdom, Sophia, and prudence, prudentia, intellectual discipline, theoretical culture, a genuine spiritual life oriented towards transcendence. These things become actively stigmatized. They are often dismissed or attacked as reactionary, irrelevant, undemocratic, or backward-looking.
While the opposite characteristics are promoted.
Yes. Disturbingly, he argues that disregard for the structure of reality, willful ignorance, especially of history, the constant spouting of irresponsible opinions based merely on passionate conviction or ideological slogans, philosophical illiteracy, spiritual dullness, and a kind of glib, sophisticated agnosticism that dismisses fundamental questions. These pathological traits are increasingly treated as virtues. They become the markers of being enlightened, forward-thinking, and open the road to public influence and success. And this whole package is often labeled progress.
That is a truly chilling and incredibly powerful diagnosis of potential civilizational malaise.
It leads directly to his famous, stark, and deeply unsettling conclusion regarding the state of modernity as he saw it. Civilization is reaction, and moral insanity is progress.
Let's summarize this final section 6, the end of modernity.
All right, the key points on the end of modernity. First, modern Gnosticism as civil theology doesn't just ignore, it actively represses the truth of the soul, leading to the bleakness of totalitarianism. Second, Voegelin places modernity within a vast Advent recession civilizational cycle centered on Christ's appearance, maximum differentiation. Modernity represents the recessive branch. Third, a core danger is the fallacy of immanentizing the eschaton, creating a false picture of reality that ignores the wisdom of limits, fortuna, and leads to destructive action. Fourth, Gnosticism's false premises contain a self-defeating factor, making its ultimate failure likely. Fifth, the communist danger in the 1950s context was linked to Western paralysis caused by the West's own entanglement in the Gnostic dream. Sixth, the crisis of modernity is manifest in a public discourse where civilization, intellectual spiritual virtues, is stigmatized as reaction, while moral insanity, disregard for reality, is lauded as progress. #outro estach.
Wow. That was a truly profound and at times quite intense journey through the core ideas of Eric Voegelin's The New Science of Politics. We started by exploring that fundamental concept of existential representation, how societies actually form, gain coherence, and develop the ability to act in history through this process called articulation.
And then how that essential existence connects to something more transcendental representation. The way society understands itself in relation to a higher truth, whether that's cosmic order in ancient empires, or the more differentiated truth accessed through the open soul in philosophy and Christian revelation.
We trace that historical struggle, the drama really, over which truth would come to define a society, focusing on the pivotal case of the Roman Empire, where Christianity eventually displaced the older civil theology and reshaped the very basis of imperial existential representation.
And then we dove headfirst into Voegelin's challenging thesis about modern Gnosticism, its surprising origins within Christianity, the foundational symbols provided by Joachim of Flora that echo through modern ideologies, the nature of that core Gnostic experience trying to draw transcendence into man, and how this impulse fuels so many seemingly disparate modern political movements.
We looked closely at the Puritan Revolution in England as a concrete historical case study of a Gnostic movement successfully invading and transforming political institutions, analyzing their ideology, tactics, and revolutionary program. And finally, we confronted Voegelin's stark conclusions about the dangers inherent in this Gnostic disregard for reality, the fallacy of trying to build heaven on earth, the resulting pathologies, and his deeply unsettling diagnosis of a modern public discourse that risks inverting the very meaning of civilization and progress.
These are definitely complex ideas. They're not sound bites. They require some real thought and engagement. But grappling with concepts like existential and transcendental representation, articulation, civil theology, the opening of the soul, that persistent tension between the truth of society and the truth of the soul, immanentizing the eschaton, the different types of Gnostic experiences, it really does offer you a powerful new toolkit.
A different lens, maybe. A way to look at political movements, historical patterns, even the arguments and conflicts swirling around us today with, perhaps, new eyes. You start asking different questions. Why do certain groups feel such absolute certainty about possessing the final truth? Why does dialogue sometimes feel impossible, like you're operating in completely different realities? What does it signify when reasoned argument and careful attention to facts seem to be losing ground in the public square?
It helps you see potential underlying structures and dynamics that go far deeper than the surface explanations we usually get.
So what does this all mean for you listening now? Well, it certainly leaves us with a rather provocative thought to chew on, building directly on Voegelin's analysis. If he's right, if the truth of society, its necessary public order and binding symbols, and the truth of the soul, that deeper differentiated individual orientation to transcendent reality are indeed in a permanent, delicate tension. And if Gnosticism represents the dangerous attempt to violently resolve this tension by repressing the soul's truth and forcing an immanent man-made creed into the position of absolute civil theology, then the question becomes,
What does this imply about the health, the stability, maybe even the long-term viability of a society that increasingly finds it difficult to even acknowledge, let alone seriously discuss, the truth of the soul? A society where such concerns are often dismissed as purely private, reactionary, or simply irrelevant to the real issues of politics and public life. What are the actual consequences when, as Voegelin so starkly put it, moral insanity might come to be applauded as progress? That's definitely something worth pondering long after this deep dive ends, a question that continues to echo and perhaps challenge us profoundly today.